Okay, so this is my Olympics database, and it's currently got 3 tables in there. It's got some details of volunteers, some venues, and then where the volunteers are allocated to. So there's my volunteer table with the data there, and I can see here that Jane Hamilton has this volunteer ID, and I can find her details quite easily in there. So there's my venues, the different places where my volunteers were going to work. And then I've got a table called allocations, and this links my volunteers to the venues and when they're going to be there. So I can see here that I've got volunteer ID 1001, and they're going to be in venue ID 2 for the first week. Now, one of the problems I've got here is that I don't know who this volunteer is. I'm not really sure what that venue ID is. But in a relational database, we can link our tables together to make it easy to find this volunteer and pick up their details from this table. But to do that, we have to create relationships between our 3 tables. So you need to click on Database Tools and then go to Relationships. And we need to show our tables. So I'm going to double click on each one and click on Close. And there we can see our 3 tables: allocations, venues and volunteers. And we need to link all these together. And the way that we do that is we look for the common fields that are in the different tables. So I can see here that in my allocations table I've got a volunteer ID and also a volunteer ID over here, the table volunteers. So I'm going to click and drag volunteer ID over to volunteer ID over here. And I'm going to tick this box that says enforce referential integrity, and I can explain that in a second. And I click on create. Okay, that just means I've got the tables open over here. So I click OK. If that happens, you can just cancel that and right click and close down the tables before I can create the relationships. So let's try again. Volunteer ID to volunteer ID. I'm going to tick enforce referential integrity, click on create, and I now have a link between my 2 tables. And the one that's common between these 2 is the venue ID. So I'm going to click on venue ID and drag venue ID on the venues table. And I'm going to tick enforce referential integrity again. Now, the important thing about ticking enforce referential integrity just means that you will make less mistakes in your database. And what it will do, it will check that when you add a venue ID to table allocations, it won't let you do it unless it already exists in your venue table. So for example, if I try and put in venue ID 14 and a venue ID doesn't exist in this table, number 14, then it won't let me do it. That means I can't add a venue that doesn't exist. So all that box means is enforce referential integrity, just make sure that I can't add something in one table unless it already exists in another table. And that's the same with the volunteers. If I try and add a volunteer ID that doesn't already exist in my volunteers table, it won't let me do it. As long as I've ticked that box that says enforce referential integrity. It just means you won't have any mistakes in your database in terms of adding someone that doesn't exist in the volunteers table. So I'm going to click on create there. And now I've got relationships between my tables. They're all linked together, and it means that if I've got a venue ID here, I can look in this table and find the relevant detail for that venue. And if I put a volunteer ID in here, I can look in this table and find their email and postcode, for example. So that's creating relationships and enforcing referential integrity in your database.